Does representation in fiction actually matter in real life? Fiction isn't real life by definition, and even nonfiction is embellished, but does that erase the potential real effects that fiction could have on our real life experiences? Let's talk about it. So, disclaimer, I'm biased. If you don't know me, I am a trans, bisexual, and disabled author. I have a lot of things under that umbrella that we might think of when we think of representation, as in identities that are placed onto us or that we assume for ourselves. And I also write fiction, so of course I have a lot of opinions on this, but I also have a lot of experiences, especially getting feedback from readers in the past 10 years. And this goes across all of my webcomics, which altogether I've had at least 50,000 subscribers, and all of their comments and feedback throughout that, and then now moving into the book realm where we're chatting about romance and different relationships, navigating different challenges within personal life, because romance is a very personal experience oftentimes. So yeah, I'm biased. But doesn't that actually make me pretty qualified to talk about this? That's why I thought it would be kind of fun, because I've had some interesting conversations about this, and as I said, have had a lot of feedback about this. So many people might hear the word representation and they automatically jump to thinking like, oh yeah, that means there is some type of identity within a character in a story, because we're talking about fiction, that identifies with a marginalized group. And that is very true. But I kind of think that representation is even bigger than that. And I'm not saying that that is any smaller or larger in terms of importance, but I think that representation is for far more than identities. Representation can be for all kinds of feelings, experiences, and different life circumstances, so it ends up being more of a way for humans to connect with each other. It's also a way for us to see that across different identities, different experiences and feelings and emotions, we still can connect. And I would say historically throughout the past 10 years, that is what I've noticed the most, where even when someone doesn't relate exactly to my characters, they can relate to their different emotions, maybe pieces of their experiences that are very important, and they are like, hey, I see myself in this, I understand this character, and also, very main point that I want to make here, it makes them also feel heard. So that is kind of the biggest piece that I see of why this matters. So I'll get to that in a second. I want to talk first about what I think is happening when we see representation in a broader sense, because I feel like another way to think of it for me is that it seems to create a humanization for people. A lot of times, especially lately, we can feel very isolated in our experiences, especially as there's increased divisiveness, as in we feel separated from each other because there's a lot of antagonizing forces that first of all separated us, but then a lot of us do believe in things that harm directly other groups, but might not realize that we're doing that. So by seeing each other and seeing how even in fiction there's ways that we can relate to our different emotions or experiences or belief systems, even, that it redirects our thoughts from isolation to connection, even without meeting face to face. Because a lot of times these are things like in fictional stories, you can create somewhat of a purposeful separation where you're like, oh hey, this is literally a fantasy world, but maybe you can relate to like the aspects of how different characters relate to each other, or that the trauma that character experiences, and you're like, wow, I can see myself in that. And deep down, even if we're not thinking about this like right in the moment while we're watching a movie or something, we'll be like, hey, a person in real life wrote this that seems to understand this experience in order to write this character. That must mean somehow I'm not alone. So yeah, we might focus on how it builds empathy, which I think is incredibly important, but it also allows others to not feel alone in their traumas and other things that feel very historically isolating. I think a lot of times, from what I've noticed with people, they do tend to focus on how traumas are represented in particular, and like, yeah, our mind focuses on things that could hurt us. That's just kind of like a natural way that we've learned how to survive as a species. A lot of times I feel like certain experiences where people are either discriminated against or they're experiencing some type of abuse or bullying, things like that, they're going to naturally feel isolated, especially like now that I've learned a lot about trauma and things too. I like to write about that in my books because it's something to me that I see people really craving. Like they crave that representation when they're like, wait, I can relate to this. When oftentimes when they're experiencing these traumas, they feel so alone, which is horrible, you know? But like, if reading a fictional story and feeling that connection from a safe distance where you can control, like, this is fictional, I'm gonna watch this and feel less alone and more connected with people, I think that's so cool. So like, that's why I especially love it. Again, I feel like a lot of people have talked about how different identities creating representation really matters. The reason why I'm talking about this more generally, even though I identify with multiple identities that need more representation of those identities in particular, is because I think that all of this also applies to that. You know, like we all have our differences and different experiences and traumas from our differences. So like people will treat me differently because I'm trans, disabled, bisexual. There's all different types of stigmas that come with those things. But within fiction, I still have found ways to relate to that. And I think if I want to create representation of any of those identities and be like, hey, here's how that experience is, and then someone who is totally not experiencing the same thing as me might still see that and be like, oh, I relate to this character for XYZ reason, then that's cool too. Like I think it's all beneficial when it comes down to it, because there's no way to take that humanization out of it when we are creating stories about people, even animals. There's been a lot of different movies created about animals, and they're very centered on empathy, because just because a character is an animal, people aren't going to be like, oh, like I can't relate to an animal. If you do, then I'm really worried for how you were like taught that, because I think that you can. I think that you can like look at things and different experiences and be like, oh, I relate to that. Probably those types of people might feel pretty alone, which is also sad. Generally, I do think that we have a lot more in common than we think we do, and I love seeing how something simple like that, where people can take their own time to process and watch or read or listen as they please in order to learn how to relate better as well. But is this really showing that fiction, something that is by definition not real, makes real life differences? Well, I think so, based on what I've shared so far, of course. But I also think that it is worth pointing out, saying that representing a certain emotion, feeling, trauma, or struggle doesn't matter is actually a very old talking point used for control and abuse. We see this particularly within white supremacy. It's very ironic that in this modern current age right now, a lot of people using representation as a bad word, saying that it's pointless, it's just some snowflake thing. That people probably don't say that as much as they did in the past like 10 years. A lot of those people are very anti-control, when historically that type of statement has been used as a form of control because it prevents connection. So anything that's preventing connection with one another, that's like shown psychologically to limit how people can rise up together and take care of each other as a community. We as a species crave that connection because that is how we've survived. That's how we've evolved to survive together. What that type of statement is actually attempting, even if it's not intended by the people repeating these statements, historically this has always attempted and been successful at being like,
if we don't see you, you don't exist.
And if someone doesn't exist, it's very easy to then do all sorts of terrible things to them because they've been dehumanized. So yeah, it gets worse. If we don't see you, you mean nothing, and then we can do whatever we want to you. And obviously that is a very dangerous place to be in, and sometimes it's not as extreme as that. but it can start out pretty small. And I do think that continuing to think that each other's experiences doesn't matter is not really useful, because none of us want to be told that ourselves. No matter how much you hate other people, I don't think that you want to feel like you don't matter. And if you do, you probably feel pretty terrible in general in life. So I'd like to just say that I do think we all matter. I think that you matter watching this, whether you agree with me or not. And I'm not here to like try to convince anybody. I just want to share what I think is interesting about representation in a deeper sense and more general sense, since I've noticed people across so many different demographics, so many different ages, coming to me to tell me simple things like, oh, your comic was so meaningful to me because my sibling went through something like this, or I went through something like this, or have a friend and I didn't know how to help them, and this helped me see like, oh yeah, this character just needed to be heard in this story, maybe I can try that in real life. Things like that. And sometimes, of course, fiction is meant to be fictional. It's not meant to be translated into real life. But I do think that it's a powerful tool and a powerful way for people to look at things, because a lot of times people do reference fiction as their only exposure to different ways that people live or different situations that they've never experienced before. Like, not everyone is going to have the experience of like cliff diving or something, but you let's say you're like, oh, I saw this show where characters were doing that and they had to put certain gear on, so now I know about that. It's like, yeah, we know in our heads that this is fictional, but we're seeing that because it was written by a real person. And also, there can be some harm in that sometimes when people write fictional things and they aren't careful about those life-saving details. But at the same time, I know that we don't have to take it that seriously either. So anyway, I always think that this is an interesting topic. I'm curious to hear what your experiences are below in terms of things that you found interesting that you related to. Because whenever I talk about these things, people usually have told me how some type of fictional story have changed people's lives. And I think that goes with nonfiction as well, of course, but I'm just talking about that as a fiction author. I hope you're having a great day. I'm looking forward to chatting with you in another video. If you don't know already, I like to stream on Twitch around 1 to 4 times a week. That sounds really random, but some weeks I'm very open and can do that. Sometimes I'm not, and we're usually drawing over there. I'm also an illustrator. Sometimes we'll play games. Sometimes we'll just chat, or we'll have like a special event. So come hang out on twitch.tv/riverkai. I'd love to see you there. I hope you're having a great day. I'll see you very soon. Goodbye.